Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana, and I am so excited to be celebrating 10 years of meaningful conversations with you. As we step into our new primetime hour, it's such an honor to share this exciting new chapter with you. So whether you're starting your day out, headed to work, or listening from wherever you are, this hour is designed to bring you thoughtful dialogue, fresh insight, and inspiring stories so you can make every moment count. So thank you for being here with me today, and let's dive in. We're here today with special guest, Som Phin, who's here to share with us her new novel, The Dancer's Shadow. Can fantasy, time travel, and storytelling help preserve Cambodia's rich history, folklore, and cultural heritage for future generations? Well, today's guest is here to share with us just that. Som Phin is a Cambodian American author dedicated to preserving Cambodia's history, folklore, and culture through storytelling. Writing across historical fiction, fantasy, literary fiction, and romantasy, she blends ancient mythology with modern themes of identity, family, resilience, and belonging. Som has published more than 35 novels inspired by Cambodian history and mythology. Her work has been widely recognized by Kirkus Review and Book Life by Publishers Weekly, including multiple editors' picks. So welcome to the show, Som Phin.
Thank you, Marianne. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I'm a Cambodian American author, and my mission is to preserve Khmer history, folklore, and culture through storytelling.
Well, what a just impressive book that you've written. And so what inspired you to write The Dancer's Shadow?
Great question. So the biggest inspiration behind the dancer's shadow was actually a young Khmer dancer here, who I didn't personally know, but he was actually a youth that my sister had worked with in the local Khmer community. And his life really, or he actually died by suicide, and that really affected me more than I expected to. He was gay, he performed Khmer dance, and from the outside, he seemed so joyful. I actually saw him perform live here in local events, but I didn't realize that he was clearly carrying so much pain that people couldn't always see. And that actually made me think about queer Khmer youth who may feel caught between family expectations, culture, identity, and really trying to understand themselves. I wanted to write a book where a queer Khmer American could be the hero, someone who is loved, connected to his culture, and still completely worthy of being belonging. So the book actually came from a place of grief, but I wanted the story itself to offer hope. I wanted a young Khmer reader to see Barack in himself and think, oh, there's nothing wrong with me. I do belong here too.
Well, I'm so sorry for your loss. I mean, it's so tough when we lose people that we know and we think they're so happy and life is going so good for them. A lot of times that comes as such a surprise.
Yes, that I think was very hard for the community because all of us were shocked. And then the reason why that kind of fueled my reason to write this book is because I was scared of that happening again, especially with other Khmer youth. So I was thinking, in my way when I started to write it, oh, I can use this to kind of present or prevent the Khmer youth from kind of going through what he went through.
So why did you choose fantasy and time travel to explore Cambodian history?
Yeah, I could have written a traditional historical novel, but I really wanted readers to experience Cambodia through Varak's eyes. So, as a Cambodian American, I think a lot of us quietly always dream about going back. I always hear that among the community and my elders, but not really going back to change history, really just to experience Cambodia our parents and grandparents remember before the Khmer Rouge genocide. So that's why I chose fantasy and time travel. Time travel gave me a way to do that. Through Varrock, readers really get to walk through the streets of Phnom Penh in the 1960s, watch how Khmer dance, meet ordinary families, and experience the beauty of Cambodia before everything changed. I think the fantasy also creates this emotional tension because Varak knows what's coming as the readers do. He knows that Khmer Kaham is only a few years away. So every beautiful moment carries this quiet sadness underneath because you know, like, oh, this is amazing, but it's going to be gone soon. And for me, the story was never really about changing history. It was about honoring the Cambodia and our parents and grandparents and how they see the country in their hearts.
Well, what a beautiful legacy to leave, especially for folks that might not be familiar or have never traveled to Cambodia.
Yes, I definitely wanted to introduce readers from other cultures to our country because I know a biggest misconception of Cambodia is always seeing and recognizing the country through the lens of the Khmer Rouge genocide and war and tragedy and displacement. And I think I was still able to honor that in this book, but still show a different side of the country and culture.
So, can you share a little bit about the story with us, A Dancer's Shadow, without going too much into it?
Yes, definitely. So the dancer Shadow follows Varak. He's a gay Khmer American who has always felt caught between two worlds. He loves Cambodia. He's second generation, but at the same time, he feels disconnected from the language, the culture, and the history his parents rarely talk about, specifically because it's so painful for them to bring it up due to having to leave because of the war. During Chum Bin, which is a huge Cambodian festival that usually happens in the fall between like September and October. It's a festival that we have every year. It honors our ancestors and kind of like the gate between the living and the dead. Something extraordinary happens in the book. He mysteriously actually wakes up in Cambodia in the 1960s. And for the first time, he gets to experience the Cambodia his family has always remembered. The music, the dance, the food, the people, and this vibrant culture that existed before the genocide changed everything. And along the way, he falls in love, forms friendships, and finally begins to understand where he comes from. But there's this heartbreaking truth that only Varak knows. He knows that in less than a decade, the Khmer Kaham will devastate the country, and many of the people he's come to love won't survive. So the novel really becomes this emotional journey about love, identity, family, and what it really means to reconnect with your heritage when you know the history itself can't be changed. At its heart, it's really about a story about finding where you belong.
How has growing up as a Cambodian American influenced both your writing and the stories you feel called to tell?
Yeah, growing up Cambodian American really shaped almost everything I write. I always felt like I was living between two worlds. At home, there was Cambodian culture everywhere. Khmer language, my parents don't speak English, so it was strictly Khmer at home. And then outside of that was American life. For a long time, I didn't feel like I completely belonged in either. As I got older, I realized I almost never saw any Cambodian characters or Khmer mythology in the books that I loved. If Cambodia was mentioned at all, it was usually through the lens of the Khmer Rouge. And that made me want to write the kind of stories I wish I had grew up reading. Stories where Khmer characters fall in love, go on adventures, explore mythology, have a more fuller sense of self, laugh, make mistakes, and simply get to just be human. And writing also became a way for me to reconnect with my own heritage. The more I researched my history and folklore, the more I actually was able to understand my parents and my ancestors, and honestly, myself. So every book I write is really two things at once. It's a story for readers, but it's also my way of preserving my culture and really reconnecting with my own heritage because I do so much research before, really laying down the foundation of the book and then building the fantasy on top.
So, what does identity and belonging mean to you, and how do these themes unfold throughout the book?
I think my definition of belonging and identity really has changed over the years. When I was younger, I thought belonging meant finding one place where I fit perfectly. But growing up Cambodian American, like I mentioned, I always felt like the in between moment. I was either, you know, too Khmer to be American and too American to be Khmer. But as I got older, I realized belonging isn't about choosing one culture over the other. It's almost embracing all of the parts of yourself. I think for me, that meant becoming proud to be Khmer instead of keeping all those parts of myself only within safe Khmer, spaces like the temple or the family gatherings. Now I feel like part of my identity is being excited to share my culture with everyone. That's actually why I write these books. And identity isn't something you figure out once and then you're done. I feel like it's always changing and evolving as you grow. And then for me, belonging just really means knowing exactly who you are. And I think that really translated into this book because in the beginning, you'll see the character of Rock feel very lost, kind of in his own shadow or a sense of love and hate with Cambodia, his own country and his own heritage. And then as you're following his story throughout the book, you'll see that he kind of ends up learning to love himself and really become himself and really just reclaim his heritage and himself and really feel like he belongs again.
Well, your work really deeply draws from Khmer history and traditions. Why is preserving these stories through fiction so important to you?
I think stories are one of the most powerful ways cultures survive. History books can tell us what happened, but stories really let us experience what it felt like to be there. For Cambodia, that's especially important. For so many people who only know Cambodia through, the Khmer Khmer, that's an important part of our history, but it's not our entire story. We have incredible, myth, dance, food traditions, and then I feel like if someone were to pick up a history book about Cambodia, they wouldn't really get all of that. But if they pick up a fantasy novel or romance or a literary novel, while they're falling in love with the characters and the events and the plot, they'll start to learn about the entire culture without even realizing it. And that's why I use fiction. I weave it into historical events. That way, the reader can really fall in love, and by the time they finish reading the book, they'll actually want to visit Cambodia or try the Khmer food. Learn a few words of the language, or simply see Cambodian people in a fuller, more human way.
I think you bring such rich Cambodian, just not history, but folklore to the stories that you write. And I want to kind of dovetail with what you said just a minute ago. I mean, you talk about weaving this together. So, how did you manage to approach this in a way that has such an interesting book, especially when we're talking about fantasy and magic and imagination?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, So for me, the history always comes first. I'll usually become very fascinated by a particular period in Cambodian history or like a particular piece of Khmer folklore. And then from there, I ask myself, okay, what kind of characters would have naturally lived in this world or in this time period? And then from there, I'll spend a lot of time, researching the history, the customs at that time, the clothing, the honorifics, the dance, pretty much everything, just to make those details feel very authentic. And then that's when the fantasy comes in. I just, built that layer. And I feel like my culture has so much rich, incredible myth. I feel like there's never material to run out of. We have Nagas, spirit, Netta, sacred forests. And I don't feel like I'm inventing magic from scratch. So I think that's always my approach. I take what I already know from both the historical piece and the folklore piece, and I, you know, integrate all that. And then I feel like I'm building stories that have been part of the Khmer culture for generations, like orally these stories are passed down, but it's always been kept like inside the community. And I feel like the fantasy lets me ask emotional questions that the history alone can't answer. Like, what if you could meet your ancestors? What if the mythology was real? What if someone from today could experience the Cambodia their family had always talked about? And I feel like those fantasy elements really make the history come alive instead of feeling like a lesson. My goal is always that the readers become so invested in the characters that they accidentally learn about, Cambodian history and the folklore like along the way.
So, is there, I'm sure there's a lot because it's such a rich culture. Is there any Cambodian mythology of folklore that maybe readers will be encountering for the first time that you can share with us?
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the most fascinating parts about Khmer mythology is not it's not really separated from our everyday life or our everyday customs. So I can definitely share about the Naga. That is a Khmer myth about a Naga princess. It's kind of like a hybrid of a serpent and a human, but she falls in love with an Indian prince. And then from there, after their marriage and their bond, the land of Cambodia is born. So that's kind of like the origin story of our country through mythology. And then in that same mythology, there's guardian spirits and sacred places. And it's so weaved into our tradition that it even influences our wedding. Like for example, the Naga, she has a tail and she's a serpent, right? I remember in my wedding, my sabai, my husband had to hold it behind me and follow me around like I was like a snake serpent, and then I would bring him to the bedroom. At that time, I did not understand what that meant, but as I learned more about my history, I was like, oh my God, I did this exact, ceremony in my wedding and I had no clue that it was even that important. So I think that's a really fun mythology to learn about just because I see it now in our culture.
That is so interesting, especially when you learn later the meaning of some of the cultural items or the cultural traditions that happen.
Yes, definitely. And I think the funniest part about that is I remember asking my mom later, I was like, oh mom, you didn't tell me, how important that portion is. And I remember her saying, oh, I stopped trying to tell you the the parts about Khmer culture because when you were younger, you always said, "Oh, it's not a big deal." Again, I don't care about it. And I remember actually saying that because I wanted to fit in when I was younger, so I just wanted to be like less Khmer and more American. And now I'm just calling my parents all the time, like, "Hey, I'm writing a new story about, this. Can you tell me more information?" So it's kind of very ironic.
It's so interesting how things come full circle. I mean, I mean, the book is so rich. Did you do a lot of research into the historical and cultural elements before writing?
Yes, definitely. So I usually always start with my parents and then other community members. And then from there, I'll actually watch, like, I love dance. So I watch old dance videos, and that usually will signify, or I'll usually use that as my way to, I can look at this, think about the story as an artistic lens for that time period. And then from there, I'll do a lot of academic research, like a lot of Google, my history, looking at old archives, and sometimes the history itself is it's kind of hard to find and pinpoint. So I'll have to use, various search engines just because during the genocide, so much of our history was lost, and that's also why I think a lot of the Khmer history and Khmer folklore isn't taught is because the source of where it was, um, had pretty much just like they were burning books and killing, teachers and librarians. So a lot of stories weren't passed down. So I feel like I'm just like pulling on scraps and trying to figure it out. But I definitely do a lot of research before writing any book, and a lot of the history I'm I try to be very sensitive to it and make sure it's accurate so that the elders when they read it they feel proud.
The dance is so woven throughout the novel, and I understand why with, sharing sharing with us what you have. What role does Cambodian dance and the performing arts play within the story and not really just the culture itself?
Yes, I love that question. So dance is really the heartbeat of the novel. I actually performed Khmer dance myself from primary school all the way up until 18. And it was one of the things that made me feel really proud to be Khmer. And when I was younger, I didn't really fully appreciate it, especially when growing up, my parents just told me, "Oh, go dance. You have to go dance. All your friends are doing it, and be proud to be Khmer." And I would just say, "Oh, okay," and I would just go along with it. Um, and I didn't realize it was because there were so few dancers left after the genocide. There was dancers teaching students, in secret. And then when we all went to the refugee camps, that's when people would raise their hand and saying, "Oh, before the Khmer home, I was actually a dancer. I can teach the youth. I can, bring back our culture." So when I wrote The Dancer's Shadow, I didn't want dance to be there just because it looked beautiful. In Khmer culture, we've always saw dancing as storytelling. Every moment has a meaning, every hand gesture, every posture, every costume tells part of a story that's been passed down for generations. So for Varak, learning dance becomes another way of reconnecting with his heritage. He's not just learning choreography, he's learning a language that his ancestors have been speaking for centuries. And I think that's why dance became so important in the novel. It isn't just something the characters do. Khmer dance is considered how we preserve history, express emotion, tell stories, and build community. And in many ways, the dance itself, I wanted the dance to be another character in the story because it carries Cambodia's history just as much as the people do. Because each dance that we have, it tells a story from like start to finish. It's usually a folklore story that we're always dancing about.
Are there common misconceptions about Cambodia? And if so, how can fiction broaden people's understanding about its rich history and culture?
Yes, definitely. Like I mentioned earlier, I think the biggest misconception is that Cambodia's entire history begins and ends with Khmer. Growing up here, whenever someone found out I was Cambodian, the first thing they would say is, "Oh, I learned about Khmer Kaham," or Khmer Rouge is the English translation. But did your family go through that? And the answer was always yes. But um, the Khmer Rouge, it's such an incredibly important part of our history, and we should never forget about it. But I think the misconception is people forget to look what happened before that and also beyond that as well. I feel like Cambodia's story is so much bigger than that. We have one of the world's greatest ancient civilizations. We have the Angkor Wat Temple, incredible mythology, classical dance, beautiful architecture if you visit the country, and very rich literature. A lot of creative dance and art and music, and really, really amazing food. And then these really beautiful traditions that have been passed down for centuries. And unfortunately, many people never get to see that side of Cambodia or, see it from that lens. And I think that's where a fiction can really help. A history book can teach you facts, but a novel really lets you fall in love with the people. And when readers, are laughing with the characters or crying with them or celebrating with them and experiencing just everyday lives, Cambodia stops feeling like this dark chapter in history and really starts feeling like a real place filled with real people. And I'm hoping that's what my books do.
Well, let's talk about your books. I understand you have more than 35 books published. Can you share about that with us and just your writing journey?
Yes, definitely. So I know when people, see my 35 novels, they're thinking, "Oh my God, how did you do that?" Because I get that question a lot. The truth is, I've always written. So when I was in middle school, I actually started writing anime fan fiction. That's the beginning of my writing career, right? Um, and then I've always just had stories right in my head. And then I remember as I got older, my stories became more of took more of a literary take as I my writing style and skill evolved. And a lot of those stories that you see published are actually stories that have been living in my head or really just really old manuscripts that I wrote on my Google Drive years ago. And the reason why I started writing more, longer manuscripts, actually full stories, is because sometimes I would read stories at night, and I just couldn't find a story that I wanted to read where, there's a Khmer character or a Khmer mythology. And I was like, oh, you know what? Forget it. I'm just gonna write my own story. So I would write my story and then read it back to myself and then go to sleep. So that's how I started my writing career, quote unquote. And then I finally reached a point where I committed to actually finishing the stories and sharing with readers. My sister was the one who actually convinced me to start publishing. And then I'm like, oh, you know what? I have kids now. I actually do want them to have books in the library about Khmer mythology and, Khmer characters and really see themselves. And then I also thought about young Khmer readers who don't just see themselves in fictional stories. Because if you Google Cambodia or Google Khmer books, it's majority of the time memoirs about the refugee camp or the Khmer Rouge, which is very important. That's what my community went through. That's what my family went through and I went through. But I just feel like the Khmer culture and Khmer characters, it's missing in the fantasy portion and the romance portion. Like I want to have fun too, and read books that I feel included in. So what ties all of my books and whatnot together is just my mission. Like whether I'm writing about fantasy, historical fiction, literary, they're all rooted in Khmer history, and you'll see that consistently show up in all my books. And I'm hoping that each book lets me preserve a different piece of Cambodia. That's why each one revisits a different time period or have a different character. I'm trying to create a much bigger picture of Cambodia than any single novel could.
Well, that is just so exciting to have such a breadth of work that has a heart of Cambodia to it.
Thank you. I'm really excited for readers to see that and really dive into the world of Khmer fantasy. My long-term goal is to build one of the largest collections of Khmer-inspired fiction across multiple genres. And the reason why I choose to write different genres is because I feel like I want the Khmer community to see themselves in each of the stories, and not everyone is the same. So I'm hoping that I'm trying to represent a little portion of each of our community in all the books.
Oh my goodness. I mean, you're such an inspiration, Som. Where can our readers and listeners connect with you and be part of your community?
Yes. So you can find my books on my Amazon store page. Again, my name is Som Phin, so you can find me on my Amazon store page. And then if readers want to connect with me directly, I'm actually very active on Instagram. My handle is Som Phin Books. And I love engaging with readers. I love when my reader says, hey, I picked up your book and I really loved it. You know, I this character reminded my sister, or oh, I haven't read about this mythology yet. But yes, you can connect with me on Instagram directly or find my books on Amazon. I recently just launched my first website. It is somphin.com.
Well, Som, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Of course. Thank you, Marianne. I really enjoyed my time speaking with you and sharing about my book and my writing journey. And I'm hoping I'll be able to come back on your show and talk again about any of my future works.
Well, that would be amazing, and I'm looking forward to our next discussion. If you'd like to connect with Som, please visit her website at somphin.com. That's SOMPHIN.com for more information on her other books and to be part of her community. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.